Welcome to
Um,
Inquiry. I'm here talking to Will Cooper about the book, The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld. Will, what is the raison d'etre of the book? For what purpose did you write the book?
Thanks, Eugene, and great to be with you. I wrote the book for a few different reasons. I think the biggest one was to entertain readers. Um, I think that's should be the goal of most books, or at least one of them. But I also wanted to humanize the story of a very controversial figure. I think Rumsfeld, like many politicians are in controversial times, gets caricatured by history, and I wanted to humanize that some for both good and bad, in terms of uh, his own uh, his own personality and activities.
When I was reading the book, I thought this book was satire. Part of the reason is because it's a political drama, and I thought it had caricatures. But as I kept reading the book, I don't think you made such a caricature out of real people. It wasn't dramatic for drama purposes. There was a bit, as you just pointed out, it's a humanization of real people. So it didn't seem like a caricature that much.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pierce through the caricature. I wanted to do the opposite of embellish. Um, I wanted to take what I think is an embellishment in most people's minds about Rumsfeld and others and actually show the intricate human dimension that everybody has, even politicians who are controversial.
Well, I have to ask a question. Rumsfeld, was Rumsfeld known as Rummy, or is that just an internal book decision?
He was known as Rummy. Yes.
Okay. Would you like to use Rummy or Rumsfeld?
Either way is totally fine.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so before we even have a discussion about Rumsfeld, I interviewed you about how America works and why it doesn't. It's a nonfiction book. Now, you might have been wrong. You have your own bias, but that's all acceptable because you're just like every other person alive. A Quiet Life was a fiction book. Whether somebody likes it or not is more personal, but even though fiction is meant to be a reflection of reality, nobody's going to hold up facts against you in the book. This book, The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld, is a little bit different, where it uses a lot of real people, situations, and events, and then adds to it fictional, fictional events and details. To be a bit more specific, fiction is very ambiguous. This type of book, even though it is fiction, it amplifies the ambiguity because it's very hard to separate what is fact and what is fiction. So I have to ask you the question: what are your sources? How would you identify fact from fiction? And to prevent the misunderstanding, I'm aware that certain events were real because I was a contemporary, but if somebody wouldn't have known or been there or read about these events and details, how would you separate the fact and fiction?
It's a great question, Eugene. I actually didn't make a point of showing whether something was fact or fiction. Some things are obviously very factual. A lot of the events were big historical events. Um, a lot of it very fictional. It runs counter to history, right? So people will know that it's uh, not true. But there was also a lot in the middle, and I did a lot of research about Rumsfeld and this history, and I just mixed it all together, and that hope what I want for readers, and I think readers have embraced it, is not always knowing where those lines are drawn, and that's part of the fun.
Fun and for me a little problematic because I could never tell, which in part, this book and other books like this might create an interest in finding out what is actually real, but that would require a lot more research. I'm just referencing it.
That's
So let's
a
begin.
good point, and I welcome the points you raised there.
Who is Rummy?
Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense under Jerry Ford in the 70s and also under George W. Bush in the 2000s. He did a bunch of other things in his life. He was a business leader, he was a member of Congress, um, and he was also, a husband, father, friend, and person in the community. So he lived a very full life.
One of the main themes in this book for Rummy is that weakness is provocative. Why? Why for Rummy and why in general?
Well, Rumsfeld felt like in national security matters and in everyday life, I think too, that when you show an opponent weakness, when you reveal weakness, the opponent, it emboldens them. It makes them stronger. It makes them fight harder. It makes them more aggressive because they sense your weakness and um, they capitalize on it. So in that sense, it's provocative, and that was a really common thing for Rumsfeld to talk about and to think, and it pervaded his worldview in international affairs.
I'm thinking that before we even begin with talking about the problems of weakness is provocative because it's a major theme in this book, I do want to kind of ask. So Rumsfeld is recognized as being intelligent, but is the opposition so predictable that if you show weakness, they'll be aggressive in return? To be specific, there's another axiom where if you're strong, appear weak, because that creates opportunities for you to engage with the opponent in a different context. And when you're weak, appear strong to prevent the antagonization. So in part, this is basically a very simplified version of ancient axioms of war. And Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. Wouldn't Rumsfeld understand um, this information? And this book had a lot of to do with this information. So weakness is provocative is basically half of a complicated view.
It's a great point, and many axioms have counterexamples going the exact opposite way. Uh, Distance makes the heart grow fonder, um, and then out of sight, out of mind, right? So um, it's you can always find or often find good axioms going the other way. Uh, it's a great point that you made there. I think the key, and I think Rumsfeld would have agreed with this, is it doesn't fit in every context, but it fits in many contexts.
So what are some of the problems with weakness is provocative? Why, what problems did they cause Rumsfeld?
Well, I think Rumsfeld was too aggressive. He was too with Iraq, with the Iraq War. He was too focused on. He was overconfident. He was too focused on um, action as opposed to inaction. Sometimes prudence weighs in favor of inaction. And um, I think with weaknesses provocative, I think he was really fixated on showing strength and using American force in a way that sent a message to the world that we were strong. And that's a valid consideration, but there's a lot of other considerations too. And the consideration I think he underweighed the most was just the unintended consequences and potential downsides of a large scale invasion.
Major critic of weakness is provocative was, I believe, Condoleezza Rice. Who
Yes.
was Rice?
She was George W. Bush's national security advisor, first 4 years or so, and then the second 4 years or so, his Secretary of State.
And what problem did Rice have with Rumsfeld?
Well, they were rivals in the administration, and in the book, I fleshed that out quite a bit. Some of it's fact, some of it's fiction, but they're rivals. And Rumsfeld and Cheney were much more aggressive. Dick Cheney, the vice president, were much more aggressive when it came to what we should do in Iraq. And Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell were much more measured in what we should do with Iraq at the time. And that all comes out in the novel.
One of the claims I believe that Rice made is that making a big mistake is just making the situation worse. It's showing weakness, not strength, in terms
Exactly.
of handling Iraq. So,
Exactly. Yep. I think that's right.
so one of the facts in the book, which I'm fully aware of, happened. 9/11 happened. Why Iraq?
Well, I think Rumsfeld and Cheney had a strong desire to um, take action, and Iraq, for a lot of reasons, was the key place to do that. Saddam Hussein was a terrible dictator. He had invaded his neighbors. He had used weapons of mass destruction on his own people. He did not have the capability to harm the United States, at least at home. U.S. military personnel in the region had heightened risks, but the homeland was not at a high risk of getting attacked. So in that sense, he was easy opponent to fight. Um, and the administration uh, wanted an example for the world where they could show that they were strong and that American military might was great. And so they chose Saddam. They chose Iraq.
There's something about the law that prevents fighting a specific terrorist group. Why did they have to pick a state actor? And more specific, if strength was needed to be shown, why not target the people responsible rather than again state authorities?
I'm not aware of a law that would prevent the United States from fighting terrorists. We certainly do that all the time, all throughout the world. Um, so you'll have to explain what you meant there in terms of fighting terrorists. In terms of going after who's responsible, the United States did invade Afghanistan. They did um, invade, or they did use military force against the Taliban, which was giving refuge to Osama bin Laden, the architect of the attack and his Al Qaeda network, which they went after and continue to go after.
So if Iraq was just a show of force, and as your book points out, we'll talk more about the international court later, but war is meant to be justified. What was the justification for the war with Iraq? And Will, you already mentioned that they wanted to remove Saddam Hussein, but the question is, what was the justification for the removal?
It was a mix of factors. Wanting to get rid of Saddam was big. Um, Weapons of mass destruction was huge, a huge stated justification, saying that Saddam had those weapons and we needed to rid the world of that threat. Of course, after the war, we've since learned that Saddam did not at the time have weapons of mass destruction, so that was a big mistake. There were a mixture of rationales wanting to build a dynamic, vibrant democracy in the Middle East, which in retrospect Looks like a pretty foolish idea, at least in the way it was stated at the time. So there were a number of rationales. It was not clear, it was not justified in a precise manner.
In this book, weapons of mass destruction played a major role in terms of the justification. So
Yes.
to be a bit more specific, what is fact and fiction? Is the fact that were multiple reasons and therefore war with Iraq, or was the major reason the weapons of mass destruction and the rest are just justifications, rationalizations for us to have a moral high ground?
It's another great question, Eugene. I think the administration, um, I don't know, I don't know the intention, but there were statements made that were false about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. Dick Cheney stood up in Nashville in a speech, and this is in the book, and it's also true, happened in real life. And he said, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. He said, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. That was wrong. At the same time, it was very true that Saddam was a brutal dictator who had used weapons of mass destruction before, had invaded Kuwait before, had done all sorts of bad things. He was a really bad uh, dictator in his own country. So it was a mix of fact and fiction, and the intention is hard to know. Colin Powell stood up at the UN. Well, he didn't stand up, but he gave a speech sitting down at the UN and outlined a very emphatic case for how Iraq had weapons of mass destruction when they did not. And Colin Powell, from my perspective, was an honorable man. I don't think he was lying. So it was a mix. I think one lesson from this to learn is how difficult it is to understand intelligence. Even the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world, which we have, the United States intelligence leaps and bounds above anyone else. We have lots of allies with great intelligence. Sometimes you know things for sure through intelligence, but often you don't. Often you don't know. And the administration should have done a better job of articulating what they know, what they knew, and what they didn't know. The great irony of that with Rumsfeld, and this is highlighted in the novel, is he was very focused on understanding the limits of his own knowledge, understanding the contours of his own knowledge. He had that famous line, that famous quote, where there's known knowns, the things we know, there's unknown knowns, the things we know we don't know, but we know they're out there. We just don't know the specifics. And then there's the unknown unknowns, just things we don't even know that we don't know. And that's an insightful framework for thinking about the world. It's true. And a great irony of history is that Rumsfeld, who was so attuned to these limits of human knowledge, got it wrong with Iraq. He thought he knew they had weapons of mass destruction, and they did not.
Well, we'll go into the fact and fiction about what America knew before going into the war, given that that is a major reason for the trial, which we'll talk about. Uh, but to your point, that is correct. State actors, we don't know what other states are thinking, and they might be misrepresenting their views as much as our own state agents are misrepresenting either their views or don't understand a lot of the interactions, or there's a lot of uncertainty about the interactions, even if you know a lot of information. Now, in terms of spoilers, the title the title is "The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld." So Rumsfeld is put on trial, but we won't spoil as to what the trial, how the trial is engaged, or the outcome of the trial. But we should talk about why there is a trial, which has to do with the uncertainty. So what did actually America know about Iraq's weapons of mass mass destruction, because in this book, it created a logistical problem of finding out whether or not Saddam Hussein actually had weapons of mass destruction. So what did America actually know? What is the fact actually? Let's begin there. What are the facts?
The America and the world knew Saddam had used weapons of mass destruction before. So they knew he had the capability to get them and was uh, capable of having them and was somebody who would use them. What America and the world did not know, I don't think they knew this, was whether or not he actually had them at the time. They assumed he had them at the time we invaded. That assumption was wrong. Based on all the information out there, he did not.
The but Rami in this book led or requested or specified an additional agency to look into whether or not they had weapons of mass destruction. And one of the causes for one of the causes for the trial was quite literally they have a recording of hierarchies inside Iraq saying no, they do not have weapons of mass destruction, and they can't prove that they don't have it because that's impossible. How can you prove something that's not even there? What did Rami actually do to obtain that information? And when that information was obtained, what did Rumsfeld do with that information? But more specifically, it's a question of how's that information used?
So in the novel, Rumsfeld finds out he gets information suggesting that Iraq does not have an active weapons of mass destruction program. And I don't want to give away too much from a spoiler perspective, but he has that evidence destroyed. That's fictional, not didn't happen, but it's a part of the novel and the story.
Two final questions. So the first is, how much power does the international court have?
What if they get jurisdiction, they can do a real trial with real consequences for people. They have a hard time getting jurisdiction uh, and actually getting people into court. It's subject to the dynamics of international relations where power tends to predominate. And so stronger countries, leaders tend not to go to trial. Weaker countries have a higher likelihood of being subject to trial.
The final question. In A Quiet Life, your novel, Iran was a target. Not Iraq, now we're moving on to Iran. In this book, The Trial of Donald H. Rumsfeld, Iran was also again a target for war. And now we are at war with Iran. Why did you assume Iran would be a target?
Well, it wasn't any great insight. Iran has been talked about as a target of for U.S. invasion for many, many years. It's been a big debate. Um, and while b- before Donald Trump's second term, it was unlikely at any given moment. I think not a huge stretch, but not definitely not something that was a foregone conclusion would happen. It was definitely a topic of debate. So I wish I was more prescient, but I didn't. I did not say they would invade Norway in the novel, and then they invaded Norway in real life. Iran was certainly among the countries most likely to be invaded by the U.S.
Thank you, Will.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Will, thank you for joining us, and thank you for clarifying what was fiction and what was fact. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Eugene. You have a wonderful show, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. Till next time.